Bonjour et bienvenue au Soberanía, le podcast sur la politique mexicaine. Je suis votre hôte, José Luis Granado Ceja, un journaliste mexicain vivant et travaillant en Mexico. Comme toujours, je suis accompagné de Kurt Akbar. Kurt, bienvenue dans l'émission. Comment ça va?
Merci beaucoup. Je lui. My name is Kurt Hackbarth, writing for Jacobin Magazine in the United States and Tito Común here in Mexico. Ready for another episode of Soberania, eh? The Canada edition. Get ready for it.
So, we're going to be talking a lot about Canada today. We thought we'd open the show, it being an officially bilingual nation, in my very bad French. My apologies to French speakers out there. I even wore my Toronto FC sweater today, just a little of a wink and a nod to the place I used to call home many years ago at this point now. And yes, we're here to talk about Canada because, well, with all of this discussion around the USMCA, TEMEC in the news, and frankly, Canada's really abhorrent behavior in all of this, we thought we'd spend some time talking about just what Canada is all about when it comes to Mexico. What is the bilateral relationship? What defines it? And of course, when we are talking about the bilateral relationship, I think the first thing that comes to mind is mining. And so we're going to be spending a little bit of time at the beginning of the program to talk about that, but I'll go ahead and share our rundown for you. Canadian mining companies plundering Mexico. And then we're going to continue with the theme, talking about Trudeau and his negotiating strategy with Donald Trump in light of this tariff threat, which we talked about in our last episode. By the way, our best performing episode yet. It is officially the number one episode. Thank you, all of you, for tuning in and sharing with your friends. Looks like it's working, getting this information out there. We're going to move on to talk about neoliberal institutions and their elimination here in Mexico. And you probably heard a lot of really bad coverage about it. And we're actually combining it with our segment, Good News from Mexico, because the way that we see it, this is really good news. It's not about eliminating transparency and facilitating corruption, which you might have read about. It's actually about destroying the vestiges of neoliberalism here in Mexico. And in Losers and Haters, we're going to spend a little bit more time than usual. We had a lovely comment from one of our viewers talking about how that's their favorite segment and that they spend a lot of time feeling connected to their homeland through that. And so this week, we're going to be talking about this awful New York Times piece, which I'm going to go ahead and throw up in here, which I found absolutely extraordinary. It was on the front page, A1, above the fold. So quite literally, the most important story that, for me, as a journalist, barely can be said to be journalism. Really, really poor example of what the New York Times does when it comes to Mexico. We're going to take some time to tear that to pieces. All right, moving on to our first topic, Canadian mining companies plundering Mexico. We're going to be leaning on this article here from my friends over at Sin Embargo, which has this headline, Bad Neighbor and Even Worse Business Partner. Canadians take away all of the richness of Mexico for almost nothing, and even then, they bargain over taxes. So this was a really hard-hitting, in-depth piece accompanied by a video, lots of interviews. Kurt, I know you've had a chance to go through with it, so can you break it down for our viewers and listeners here? What's this article about? Why is it important in this conversation that we're having about the Mexico-Canada relationship?
Sure, Jose Luis. So this is a particularly important investigation that comes out from Sin Embargo, right at the time where, as we've talked about, and we'll be talking about more on this episode, Canada is behaving quite badly, right? That they're trying to find a way to throw Mexico under the bus in a desperate attempt to, salvage their own position within the North American trading bloc and to try to ward off the Trumpian tariffs, right? But what's really underreported at the same time when, Canadian politicians come out with, don't compare us with Mexico, and Mexico's got to behave, and Mexico this, and Mexico that. Here's the topic they should be talking a lot more about when we're talking about behaving badly. And that is the fact that the colonization never really ended, Jose Luis, right? The colonial era supposedly ran from 1521 through to 1821, 300 years through the Spanish crown, and then Mexico as an independent, of course, republic for the last 200 years. And then we can talk about neocolonialism. But this is a really brutal example of how the mineral extraction that began at that time continues unabated to this day. And the number one culprit of this, you would think it would be the United States, right? It's being the number one culprit of so many things. No, it's Canada. It's Canada. As this article points out, of the foreign mining companies in Mexico, 73.5% of them are Canadian, and only 10.2% of them are the United States. So let's talk about how they operate down here, how they run, what they do. Because the big Canadian argument is they create jobs. They create jobs for Mexicans here in the country, and they pay taxes. And what this article points out is those two things are fabrications, Jose Luis. The article points out, and this is really a stunning figure for me, if you go down just a little bit, that less than 1% of tax receipts in Mexico comes from the mining industry. Less than 1%, 0.91% of tax receipts comes from mining. Mining also creates less than 1% of the total formal employment in Mexico. It's right there on the screen, 0.62% of employment, formal employment. So they're paying less than 1% of taxes, and they're providing less than 1% of jobs, of formal jobs. There are maybe some knock-on jobs and, contracting jobs. I mean, actual formal sector jobs, very few, about 160,000 in Mexico. How is it that they're able to pay so little in taxes? Well, first of all, because there's a little thing called the Free Trade Agreement, and they try to use the Free Trade Agreement to manipulate the Mexican tax system. Another reason is the reimbursements of sales tax, or the value-added tax called IVA, which they take tremendous advantage of to basically write off all their sales tax and even get that tax reimbursed. Right? One of the big culprits in this is First Majestic Silver. Right? First Majestic Silver, which has nothing less than $180 million tax bill with the Mexican SAT, the Mexican Hacienda, the Mexican tax office, that they don't want to pay, and they're running crying to the Free Trade Agreement to try to get that tax bill forgiven. Very much like our old friend Ricardo Salinas Pliego, who doesn't want to pay his taxes either, the Electra guy, the TV Azteca guy. You have Canadian mining companies playing the exact same game, running to the Free Trade Agreement, saying, oh, we're getting unfair and discriminatory treatment, because, oh my God, Mexico wants them to pay the little in taxes that they already have to pay. I mean, it really is extraordinary, Jose Luis. And, I like what the response was from the Mexican tax office, from Raquel Buenrostro, who was at the time the head of the tax office. She says, everything related to fiscal matters has nothing to do with international treaties. Fiscal matters are resolved in the country where the fiscal problem is had. And this international arbitrary process is another kind of sanction for another kind of activity. Right? So this is why you have this absolute abuse of the tax system in Mexico, with trying to use the Free Trade Agreement as their shield, as is happening in the case of First Majestic, right? That is a very, very important point to make, right? Now, another point to make with regards to this is that Mexico is finally pulling in the leash on this a little bit, right? Pulling in the leash a little bit. In 2023, they passed a mining law, which I criticized at the time as not being strong enough, but it was something. AMLO presented a stronger law to the Congress that they then watered down, clearly under lobbyist pressure. But the mining laws got some good things. It makes it easier to cancel mining licenses if they don't pay taxes for 2 years straight. It reduces the number of the length of licenses from 50 to 30 years. It eliminates the preference position of mining as a preferential activity, which gave it all kinds of priorities over other activities in Mexico and over environmental and other restrictions. Let us not forget that the whole mining setup that exists in Mexico today, the exploitative, awful mining setup, comes from Carlos Salinas de Gortari at the beginning of the 90s, and is part and parcel of opening Mexico to NAFTA, right? And that means, abusive use of water, of environmental restrictions, labor, taxes, you name it, right? total open door to foreign mining, which they've abused to the T. So according to the new law, mining was no longer going to be a preferential activity. Right? They've also eliminated mining in underwater areas and in protected areas, prioritized legally water for domestic use, and also required consultations with local and indigenous populations. So what you can really see, Jose Luis, is that part of this Trudeauian attempt to throw Mexico under a bus is very much simply just a mafia-esque kind of threat, right? We see you're turning the screws in the mining activity. Don't even think about turning the screws anymore. Don't even think about it, right? Because there are voices within Morena who, like me and others, who are unsatisfied with that 2023 law and want to revisit it and want to toughen it up, right? So this can very much be seen as Trudeau playing the mafia boss and saying, don't come after our mining enterprises any more than you already have.
I love the analogy. I love the analogy. I'll just jump in here. There's a joke amongst leftist circles in Canada, which is that Canada isn't really a country. It's just 3 mining companies in a trench coat. And the way that you talk about it makes perfect sense. Here he is trying to secure beneficial situations through exploitation, through plundering for these Canadian mining companies. I'm speaking, of course, of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He's not acting like a statesman. He's not acting like a leader. He's acting like a fierce defender of Canadian mining capital. That is the story of Canada and Mexico if you had to reduce it to a single sentence.
And as the article points out, Trudeau, can hardly claim ignorance on the matter. In April of 2016, he received a letter from over 180 organizations in Latin America and other countries with this request that he regulate the behavior of Canadian mining companies abroad. He ignored it. I understand that he set up a very toothless watchdog agency within Canada, but the argument always is that's not our jurisdiction. That's not our matter, right? But isn't it funny, the hypocrisy of things? Whenever Mexico tries to do something to benefit the Mexican people, like the energy reform or the judicial reform, there you have the U.S. and Canada butting into Mexican affairs and to Mexico internal affairs with the excuse of the free trade agreement, saying that, this affects our companies. This affects our companies. So there's jurisdiction then. But when you ask Trudeau to, go after the abusive behavior of their mining companies, not a jurisdiction. Hands off, nothing to do with it, right? Mexican internal affairs are their jurisdiction, but the affairs of their mining companies in Mexico, not their jurisdiction. Isn't that a beautiful piece of hypocrisy and a beautifully selective use of the free trade agreement?
Yeah, absolutely. Before you move on, I wanted to stick on this because it's something I worked on a little bit when I lived in Canada, working in solidarity with organizations in Mexico and Latin America more broadly. This is a long-standing demand. There have been organizations that have been pushing this both in Canada and abroad and have basically been met with these kinds of tactics. So they've established a so-called watchdog, which has no powers. It basically can do nothing. All it can do is wag its finger. I mean, and they begged and they pleaded and they said, we need something that can actually follow through on this. And of course, they didn't. Why? It's not a coincidence that the majority of mining companies have their headquarters in Canada. The entire legal structure of Canada is designed to facilitate them to be able to engage in this kind of exploitation without consequence. So of course, the Canadian state is not going to jump in and do something that might actually affect those interests because those go above the interests of Canadians and certainly the interests above the people of Latin America, Central America in particular, Mexico, of course, also being victim. And I find it extraordinary that they try to paint themselves as the victims, right? There have been many, many cases that have been brought to the Human Rights Commission. There's a famous case of Mariano Abarca, who was resisting a mine in his community of Chicomucelo. And when he got close to the embassy, he tried to tell them, listen, we need your help because this company is issuing death threats. It's come after my family, right? They rely on your expertise to be able to do what they're doing. You have to intervene, directly intervening with the embassy. And ultimately, Mariano Abarca was killed. He was killed for his activism, trying to stop that. And his son continued to pressure it. And like, the embassy is responsible for this. You were helping making this happen. You have it in your own rules that your diplomats aren't meant to protect human rights, but actually are meant to facilitate the entry of Canadian capital, mining capital, into Mexico to be able to do this. Where's your responsibility? So, of course, the Supreme Court decided that they didn't want to hear it in Canada. And then that's kind of where it ended. So they had to go to the Human Rights Commission, the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. But this issue of the prioritization of the mining company's interests over those of human rights is actually really part and parcel of Canada's policy towards Mexico. I have this press release here on the screen, right, where they submitted a 30-page document to the UN Human Rights Council in April of 2023, denouncing Canada for its diplomatic support for mining companies over the safety of human rights and environmental offenders, that it reads there. It draws on 5 well-documented cases. I mentioned the one of Mexico, but it's quite extraordinary. We're not just talking about, the legislation doesn't have enough teeth, or politicians are, careful not to step on the toes of the mining company CEOs and the stakeholders. But we're actually talking about a situation where it is policy of the diplomatic offices of Canada, which is to say, so it is policy of the Canadian state to actually pursue things that end up violating human rights. That's what we're talking about. They are violators as state policy of human rights.
And let us not forget, Mexico is a country that is 80% mestizo and indigenous, right? And it's not lost on the Mexican population how Canada basically, taking their experience from how they've treated indigenous lands in Canada in order to be able to fine-tune their practices, to come to Mexico and exploit, divide and conquer, separate, pit communities against each other, create these kind of false ideas of we're all in it together and we're going to give you all these benefits, when all they're, what they've historically done is undermine attempts to hold them to account, right? It's really terrible, the effects on these communities. Very much how, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, used their experience repressing the Irish population to take that abroad, take that internationally when it came to repressing people in other parts of the world. You take your experience at home, and then that becomes your model for using that abroad. Right?
The Canadian reserve system was a model for apartheid and for the Nazis, for their systems. Just to show you how awful of a system it is. It wasn't that long ago. I disagree with the term, but I'm respectful of the process that led to it. But they ultimately concluded, the Truth and Reconciliation, that Canada committed cultural genocide. I think Canada committed outright genocide, not just cultural genocide. But I feel like for the political reasons, they had to kind of soften the blow, lest they say that Canada actually committed genocide. The school system, the residential school system, it's awful. It lasted up until the 90s. Like, this isn't a relic.
Very recently.
What Canada did to Indigenous people in Canada, it continues to do to Indigenous, mestizo, brown peoples in the global South as official state policy.
Right. Now, another reason why Trudeau is probably playing mafia boss and trying to warn Mexico away from turning the screws anymore is just in this new budget, mining taxes have gone up. So, they have to pay their standard tax in Mexico, right? The income tax and EVA, which they can, usually get written off. But there's also a special mining tax, which has been raised in this budget from 7 to 8.5%. And then an extraordinary tax on top of that for mining related to gold, silver, and platinum, which has gone up from 0.5% to 1%. Right? These are taxes in addition to the standard tax base. Pretty minor stuff, but just that is enough to get these people upset. Just that, right? Because this is where their big profits come from. The exploitation of countries like Mexico and Peru and the rest of Latin America, that sustains these enterprises, just like the profits of foreign banks in Mexico, because they can charge all kinds of commissions up the wazoo to people. They get more profits in Mexico and Latin America than in their countries of origin. So even the hint that they're going to have to pay just $1 more in taxes, right, Oh, the shareholders. Oh, this. Oh, that. Right? So all the political machinations start, right? We're going to toss Mexico out of the free trade agreement. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And of course, the excuse is China. And as we're going to see later, they have absolutely no evidence to prove that China is using Mexico as a backdoor to bring their products into United States and Canada. They just changed the subject because they have no evidence for it. The real gritty, nitty gritty of it is they don't want their mining interests touched, Jose Luis. And so that's why this, that's why this investigation by Sin Embargo is so important. And just to put this in perspective to close, commerce creates 20% of jobs in Mexico, construction 7%, energy 28%, mining less than 1%. So expropriate the bastards. If they're going to play hardball, expropriate the bastards. Make those mines Mexican. I conclude with that.
I mean, when I saw that figure, 0.62% of direct employment is tied to mining. I mean, that's their big promise. Every time they go to a community, it's always, we're going to bring you jobs, we're going to bring you development, and ultimately they bring very little jobs, they pay very little taxes, and they destroy the environments that they end up operating in. Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. The amount of minerals they're taking out of Mexico exceeds exponentially what they took out throughout the entire 300 years of the colony. Let us not forget. The technology is so much more advanced.
That's right. And so that brings us to our next topic here. Of course, Trudeau trying to throw Mexico under the bus. Now, maybe this is motivated by the fact that Trudeau, who likes to present himself as a progressive, even though he doesn't have a progressive bone in his body and betrayed many of his promises, is actually threatened by a real progressive left-wing policy happening south of the border in Mexico. And so now we've seen this very curious position by Canadian politicians. And I'll admit, I kind of misread it at the beginning. We first, I think, heard it in a loud way from Doug Ford. Doug Ford is the Premier of Ontario, Canada's largest province, its most economically important province, a right-wing conservative, kind of a bit of a loose cannon. He starts talking about needing to exclude Mexico from the free trade agreement. And we talked about this in the previous episode, so we won't get into too much detail here. But it's obviously led to the situation where now it's actually a bit of a louder voice now. We've seen important figures, not from provincial governments, but from federal governments, including Trudeau himself, sort of point to this fake issue that China is using Mexico as a backdoor to get in cheap products that North American companies and workers can't compete in, et cetera, et cetera. He said so. We talked about it last week where, he assures Sheinbaum that he's not going to go down this path, but then he's asked about it a few days later and he says, well, we have to consider there are very real concerns. Of course, they can't point to any of these so-called backdoor channels that China is allegedly engaging in here in Mexico. Again, reminding people the only BYD auto plant that exists in North America is in the United States. And it's not in Mexico. Now there's talk of one being built, but
Pasadena, California. I think they're using that as a backdoor into the Mexican market.
That's what that's it. We should turn the guns on them. Mm-hmm. So we've seen this kind of attitude as actually starting to have some resonance in Canadian political circles. I watched an interview with Marcelo Ebrard on Sin Embargo, and he actually made some really good points. He's like, you have to understand something. Trudeau is a very weak political leader. He has very low approval ratings. He is in a minority government, which basically means his party doesn't have enough seats on its own to form the government in Canada. It's the Westminster system. And so he relies on the support of opposition parties, basically not turfing his government. And quite likely in the next election, which is probably going to be in 2025, he's going to lose. And so he's a very weak politician leading a very weak government that is panicking at the notion of another Trump presidency. We've talked about this before. They've reacted very poorly to this, but it seems that part of their strategy is this, to throw Mexico under the bus. And in particular, we've seen some of this language where he's just insisting, you can't compare us to Mexico. It's incomparable. How dare you lump us in together? Which, to be honest, reeks of racism to me. I think there is an undercurrent, to put it lightly, of racism underneath this. And in some cases, in the case of Doug Ford, I'll throw this up real quick here on the screen, outright racism. He said recently that to compare us to Mexico is the most insulting thing I've ever heard from our friends and closest allies. I found his comments unfair and found them insulting. It's like a family member stabbing you right in the heart. Wow. That's really racist, to quote a meme, right? That's Doug Ford. But unfortunately, this is actually having some kind of repercussions. We're seeing this actually possibly manifest into the position of Canada, where we see this headline: the risk of Mexico being shut out of North America is rising. And I think part of it is driven by these Canadian politicians. Why are they doing it? Well, for reasons we just explained, there seems to be some political differences between Ottawa and Mexico City, but also Canada is worried about a Trump presidency and thinks it can maybe save its own skin by negotiating a bilateral deal with the United States, so excluding Mexico. And again, I know we've mentioned it before, but we have to remember the only reason Canada was in the earlier round of negotiations under the first Trump presidency was because of Mexico. Because of López Obrador, who said, no, this is a tripartite deal. We should stick to it. The three countries of North America as an economic bloc. To exclude Canada would be a mistake. And ultimately, Trump conceded that and allowed them. And now we see that good neighbor policy by Mexico towards Canada, despite everything we just talked about, despite Canada's awful record in this country, is to throw them under the bus.
Yeah, it's like the classic, gods, the classic line of never trust the white man. I mean, it's really, Jesus Christ, just like the United States broke every single treaty with the indigenous peoples on their march across from the Atlantic to the Pacific, right? Here you have, pretty boy Trudeau, who accepts AMLO's help to stay in the free trade agreement at the last negotiation, right? No thanks that I've seen, but just accepts it, takes it, and runs with it. And now, when it's convenient for him, right, for his own political purposes, very willing to use Mexico as a piñata, as is said here in Mexico, right? Following the Trump model that he used in the 2016 campaign, right, with the idea of Mexico sending their rapists, sending their whatever else. Just look at some of the people in the Trump cabinet, just as want to talk about kind of people with kind of weird sexual things going on there. Bad hombres and all this. Mexico is a convenient piñata for these people, right? And it's this campaign. Trump was not as open with the racist comments, but of course, the whole border thing. He used Mexico as a piñata in its own way anyway, and it's really pathetic to see Trudeau jumping on this train. It's pathetic to see Trudeau jumping on this train, right? And then running down to Mar-a-Lago to spend 3 hours with Trump, sitting at the table, taking their picture, and getting nothing, from what I could see, out of it. Really in contrast to, as we talked about in the last episode, the firm, diplomatic, adult, informed position of Claudia Sheinbaum, who with one letter changed the debate within the United States. I have never seen so many podcasts, and I was following them for a new article in Jacobin that I'm working on. So many podcasts, all of a sudden discovering that Mexico exists and the fourth transformation exists. And, all this exists because it fits conveniently into their anti-Trumpian discourse. But anyway, all of a sudden they discovered that Mexico's got a progressive movement. Oh, well, this is only something we've been talking about for the last 6 years. But with one firm letter, she changed the course of the debate. Now Trump isn't talking about tariffs against Mexico. He's talking about something else. She knocked him off course. So, Justin could learn a lot. First of all, with regards to elemental politics, and on the other hand, not to just be such a treacherous little snot also. Those are those.
He's so unbearable. I'm really glad you mentioned Sheinbaum's letter. If you allow me, I actually wrote my column for the Mexico Solidarity Project Bulletin this month on this, and I'm going to read some snippets of it here. Actually, I want to know what you think before I get started on this. I decided I needed to come up with a new nickname for Donald Trump. There's too many cliches. He's a bully. He's this and that, right? And I remember Hugo Chavez used to call George W. Bush Mr. Danger. And it was based on a story where the main antagonist was called Mr. Danger. So I've decided that I'm going to start calling Trump El Charro Negro. Now, for those of you who don't know, El Charro Negro is a story in Mexican folklore. He's like this dark figure and actually represents, in many cultures, not universally, the threat of greed, exploitation, of colonization. He's often pictured as this looming figure from abroad. And it's a cautionary tale to kind of warn people of the dangers of outsiders. In fact, even today, you'll see people that actually advocate that you need to do a tribute to El Charro Negro if you're going to do a mining project, for example. So I figured it was apropos. And my conclusion was that in her first battle with El Charro Negro, President Claudia Sheinbaum emerged the victor. Now, she, following Trump's election victory, she pledged that her government would face any potential challenges in the bilateral relationship with dignity and pride, and that she would tackle the problems head on. Contrast that to the reaction of the Canadian government of Trudeau, whose deputy prime minister hit the panic button and immediately moved to reconstitute an emergency cabinet-level committee to deal with the threat of the urgent issue that is a Trump White House. But of course, the governments of both Mexico and Canada were forced to respond sooner than expected after Trump doubled down on his threat to impose 25% tariffs on goods from Mexico, Canada, and China as part of his efforts to persuade these countries to take more action to stem the flow of drugs and migrants into the United States. True to her word, Sheinbaum penned a refreshingly candid letter to Trump, where she told the incoming U.S. president, in no uncertain terms, that his negotiating methods would not work and that U.S. tariffs would be met with a reciprocal policy. But she also reminded him of the U.S. role in the ongoing crisis, saying, quote, 70% of the illegal weapons seized from criminals in Mexico come from your country. We do not produce these weapons, nor do we consume synthetic drugs. Tragically, it is in our country that lives are lost to the violence resulting from meeting the drug demand in yours. Now, end quote. While some pundits said infamously sexist Trump would react poorly to a woman calling his bluff, as you said, Kurt, Sheinbaum successfully said that the two had a friendly conversation concerning drugs and migration, and that they had pledged to have an ongoing dialogue concerning these key areas of concern for the incoming Trump administration. She even said, in an underreported piece of the conversation, that she told Trump directly that the U.S. should end its blockade of Cuba and Venezuela if she wants to see reduced migration to the U.S. And Trump said, for his part, that the two had a wonderful and very productive conversation. Here's the key part. The Mexican government strategy to confidently face down El Charro Negro appears to be working so far. In his interview with Sin Embargo, Economy Minister Marcelo Ebrard defended Mexico's strategy while poking fun at Trudeau, who opted to scurry off to Mar-a-Lago to talk with Trump. This is a quote from his interview with Los Periodistas. Mexico, in addition to being more important to the U.S., has a very strong government, so we do not have a need to rush to a meeting. I think that the strategy being followed by President Sheinbaum is much better because she set a very firm position in her letter saying that we want to negotiate. We're not going to rush to see what they want, because if you do that, you'll be run over, end quote. So, with Trump now threatening 100% tariffs on BRICS countries, political analysts have speculated Trump is merely using the threat of tariffs as a negotiating tool that is unlikely to actually come to pass, especially given the likely devastating economic impact. However, Trump, like El Charro Negro, is notorious for transgressing established norms. Sheinbaum just proved that the best strategy, in any case, is to face down El Charro Negro directly with dignity.
Very good. I like that, Charro Negro. So we can get that to catch on.
Let's see if we can get a catch on. Feel free to use it. All right. I wanted to finally share one final thing here, which I found extraordinary about Canada's position in all of this. So we talked about how there seems to be winning support, this idea of pushing Mexico out, and it's sustained by this lie that it is a backdoor for China. And in fact, in a recent press conference, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, an awful politician with awful politics, with Nazi skeletons in her closet, was asked directly, well, what proof do you have concretely? Yeah. Do you have any evidence that this is happening?
Let's hear it.
Mm-hmm. And she couldn't give an answer. No answer. There was no evidence. She just kind of went on a tirade about the need to conform, to have a united strategy in the face of China. It seems very clear that the ask of Canada will likely be, we'll keep Mexico in the deal, but you have to close the door to China. We have to be a single bloc that is an economic union of sorts between Canada, the United States, and Mexico to combat as an economic bloc the so-called rise of China. That seems to be what they're actually pushing for, and they're willing to lie to get there. I trust Claudia. I think she'll be very prudent and will not be able to handle this. And again, I think Canada should be careful because ultimately they could be the ones who get kicked out.
Right.
All right. Moving on to our next topic. We're going to say goodbye to neoliberal institutions here in Mexico. And I'll throw this headline up here. As Mexico advances its plan to dissolve watchdog agencies, critics cry foul. Now, this isn't the losers and haters section, but I can't help but actually point out something absurd about this piece. Now, this is by Al Jazeera staff, so what they do is they take pieces from The Wire and then turn it into a refried story. And it's obviously the story about the efforts by the Mexican Congress to move forward on what it promised in the campaign, on what López Obrador said that he wanted to do during his government, and that now Claudia Sheinbaum and her government is following through on, which is, of course, dissolving these so-called independent watchdog agencies. But who do they choose to quote, to lead the criticism of this?
This
None
is
other
really
than
good.
Alejandro Moreno Cardenas, Alito, the pre-president. And what? Fine, he's an opposition politician. Obviously, he's going to present his political arguments. But the ones that they put forward here is just absolutely extraordinary. The leader of the PRI, and remembering what the PRI represents in this country, talking about this being a direct attack against the rights of Mexican and even democracy itself. And further on, says, we firmly defend the transparency and rights of our country. Mexico does not deserve to go backwards, accusing the Morena party of an authoritarian streak. That is as rich as it gets, coming from the PRI. The corrupt, allegedly corrupt, deeply, deeply stained figure that is Alito Morena, representing the even more stained Institutional Revolutionary Party. Absolutely extraordinary that that's what they decided to highlight. But Kurt, I wanted to hear your thoughts on this decision. What do you make of the fact that they've actually followed through on this and they're actually disappearing? Should we believe this? Should we believe these so-called international NGOs that say that this is a step back, that this is part of an authoritarian backslide, and that that's why they're saying that they are sounding the alarm when it comes to this decision by the Mexican Congress and the Mexican government?
Yeah, so just first of all, just a little anecdote, right? Maybe this should go in our bonus section, which we don't have because it's where we believe in free and open access. But I was out of Al Jazeera a couple times, talking about Mexico, and you'd think, all right, maybe Al Jazeera's got a little bit of a better take on Mexico than NBC, CNN, all these people, right? The last time I was on, they tried to set up the clip that AMLO was going to be negotiating directly with the cartels, something he never said. One of the families organizations up in Nuevo León, broached the issue at a mañanera that they wanted to have some kind of contact with organized crime groups in the area so they could get to where their grave sites are, right? What they wanted to do was find the bodies, find their family members. AMLO said that was an important job. So that got blown up that AMLO is going to deal with the cartels. So the first question I got when I got on the air was, if you can't beat them, join them, eh, Kurt? That's, the smarmy anchor thing. I said, that's not what he said. That's not what he said. And I just very calmly pointed out what he had said in the context of it and the fact that López Obrador was not in favor of negotiating with the cartels. Of course, the anchor didn't like it. The clip was ended, I wasn't cut off, but it was ended, fairly quickly. And I've never been invited back on, right? And it's certainly not for lack of knowledge of the subject. It's simply because they don't like anyone who pushes back against their framing, which they use for very specific sensationalist reasons, and they all do it. So that's just the anecdote there. I know you've had your own unfortunate experience with Al Jazeera, Jose Luis. With regards to the independent agencies, first of all, it's just bizarre and stupid that they use Alito Moreno as their main source, right? From the hegemonic party that ruled the country with an iron fist for 71 consecutive years, to then say that that's the guy who's saying that there's now authoritarian tactics. This from the uber corrupt former governor of Campeche, who has a palatial mansion built on the bones of corruption, metaphorically. The bones of corruption. He built this palatial mansion and is just about to lose his immunity so that he can be brought up on charges. Because what these people do is they just jump from congressional post to try to maintain their immunity from prosecution. So they chose Al Jazeera, perhaps the top three of the most corrupt, least popular, least credible politicians in the country, as their lead source for this article. Al Jazeera, you should start having people like us back on again so you don't write this crap. Now, What's the issue with these independent organizations? These autonomous organizations, and I think we've talked about it before on the show, were set up in the era of the managed democracy post 2000,
Mhm.
right? This transition to the simulated democracy, where the idea is, well, we're going to have a lot of independent, autonomous organizations within the executive branch, right? So we can tick off all the boxes with international NGOs and such. The point of these organizations was never to do the job that they were set out to do. And they never did. The competition agency never stopped private sector monopolies. The transparency agency never provided transparency. Quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. All of the drug war documents from Felipe Calderon are still under wraps until 2029, thanks to that very agency. So there was a bunch of agencies set up to ostensibly do things like, fight monopolies and provide transparency and whatever else. What they really were two things. First of all, a jobs agency for friends of the elite who they couldn't get into jobs in the actual federal government, throw them into jobs in the autonomous agencies with great salaries, with American Express cards to go to table dances, and not making this up, and to take all expenses paid trips to the Caribbean and to Europe, right? All with this idea that we're the autonomous agencies, right? So that was one thing there. And the second of all was to ensure that if a progressive government ever got into power, they would never be able to actually fully carry out their program. To keep them exactly that, right? Handcuffed. Just like the whole idea of NAFTA back in the 90s was to prevent against a democratic opening down the road. So the whole idea of these quote unquote autonomous agencies was to handcuff the executive branch from really going after private monopolies by strengthening the public sector. How do you go after private monopolies? You strengthen the public sector. But the competitiveness agency was saying, oh, no, you can't do that because you're creating a monopoly, which is why it's so important what they just did with this recent constitutional reform, which was saying that, the Federal Electricity Commission and Pemex are not subject to that kind of law, They operate in the public interest. But that's the way these autonomous agencies rolled, right? When AMLO acquired those electricity producing plants from Iberdrola in Spain, they set up all kinds of rules on that. So these were set up never to do the job that they were ostensibly let out to do, but to prevent an executive branch from actually creating, real economic conditions in the country for the people, and real conditions where democracy could be developed and pushed along, right? So there were obstacles to that. Plus this whole idea of waste in budgets and duplication of functions, right? And now all these people are crying to the skies that Mexico is becoming more authoritarian. Whoever said that all these necessary functions have to be done by autonomous separate agencies? They can be done by the executive branch, and that's what's happening. They're simply rolling those functions into the corresponding executive branch agency to do it, right? Which happens in a multitude of countries. The executive branch carries out these functions. But what they were trying to do was, bleed the executive branch from 1,000 cuts so that it could never actually do anything if it were ever to want to. In the era of simulated democracy, it never really wanted to, so the autonomous agencies really didn't have to do much heavy lifting. But now, just like the Supreme Court came out of dormancy to start vetoing every single law that AMLO came up with, practically, when they never did that before, the same things. The autonomous agencies had to come out of dormancy and all of a sudden started, raising hue and cry because they were actually changing things that affected that elite that staffs those agencies.
Exactly.
That's the story.
The neoliberal era ended with the election of López Obrador. Now, are there elements of neoliberalism? Sure. But this is part of the process aimed at dismantling that previous neoliberal regime. And I have this here up on the screen here. President Claudia Sheinbaum highlighted the need to restructure these autonomous organisms created during the neoliberal period. She said that these autonomous agencies did not have as its objective to stop private monopolies, but instead, in practice, what they actually did was they dedicated themselves to limiting the growth of public companies, especially in the energy sector.
That was it.
That was
their
the part
entire real thing.
that never gets talked about. And that's the part that I want our friends who sympathize with the left to pay attention to. Don't listen to these voices. Don't read this Al Jazeera article or this New York Times article, whatever it is, that talks about it being erosion of transparency, or an authoritarian backslide. This is the class struggle. This is using your power as the government to roll back these previous neoliberal policies that sought to carve out democratic control over parts that should be under the purview of the executive. This is a progressive move, people. Now, don't believe me? Go ahead and look. David Ludenow, former bureau chief of Latin America for the Wall Street Journal. What does he say? And this is the same exact clip that I'm referencing, where she talks about the need for public companies to play a bigger role as a motor of the economy, which is something that I've really harped on here on the program. And he says, Mexico's president saying state-run companies should be the motor of the economy. It's almost as if the last century of economic evidence is totally forgotten. Do you see? Do you see how somebody like David Ludenow, a fierce advocate of neoliberalism, views this? Now, if he's against these agencies being restructured, it should give you a clue about why leftists should actually be in favor, because this is the linchpin. This is the key. Thanks to this, the project of having more control over the commanding heights in order to redistribute it to the population requires this. This is actually a leftist progressive policy, and you need to stop being deceived by the same people who are allowed to have bylines in these stories because they obey that neoliberal order. We have to expand our horizon and understand what's actually happening here. And there's actually a really good response because, of course, the reason this is happening, the reason why Mexico has elected with a strong mandate a leftist government led by Morena with Claudia Sheinbaum at the head, is because we've lived through the neoliberal period. We've seen what the so-called economic evidence. I wanted to put this up here from Kyle. He's an excellent commentator here on social media. He says, the last time Mexico privatized its state-run industries, it was at the behest of IMF structural adjustment, which drained $26 billion from Mexico to Western banks in interest payments alone by the end of 1980s. So I don't think they need your economic evidence. And of course, he's responding to David here. That's the point, right? These structures, these institutions were created in a very specific context after the fall of the Iron Curtain, the end of actually existing socialism, the threat of that, where the so-called end of history said capitalism is the only path. That too, that era has changed. And now we're trying to figure out different ways and dismantling those things that are impediments to being able to successfully be able to reorganize this country's economies to the favor of the people who live here, which is the way it always should be. Call that what you will. I call it socialism. But that is what we're trying to do. And I think people should pay more attention to that element of it, not these think tanks who all obey the same old order. There's a reason that you're hearing from them. It's time to listen to other voices.
That's right. So the whole idea of the autonomous industry was simply to just kick issues into the grass, right? Back of the day. And then all of a sudden they start rearing their head when, things that were actually being done to, strengthen the people's role in their own government and in their own economy actually started being done. So, as you say, there very well, Jose Luis, if somebody like David is against it, man, you got to be for it.
All right. So on our final one, losers and haters, we're going to be spending the last 10 minutes here talking about this article in the New York Times. Mexican cartels lure chemistry students to make fentanyl. Criminals turn college campuses into recruitment hubs, recruiting chemistry students in Mexico with big paydays. Now, remind you, this was on Sunday's A1 Above the Fold. That's how important this article was to the editors of the New York Times, giving it that prominent place. A couple of things here. It's a story about young people moving into organized crime networks to seek employment, to process this, etc. Now, do I believe that there are young people, young talented chemists, perhaps, who are being seduced into this? Absolutely. Of course it happens. I mean, we are still trying to dig ourselves out of this hole. Organized crime has tentacles everywhere. It's very difficult as a young person to try to make it in an honest way, to not fall victim to their recruitment tactics, to their extortion tactics. So it's certainly I'm not trying to suggest that what they're writing about here in this article isn't the case. But the fact that they give it this attention, and then secondly, there is no balance to this piece whatsoever.
No.
Claudia Sheinbaum is mentioned one time. Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro, Youth Building the Future, the flagship program by López Obrador, continued by Claudia Sheinbaum, meant to attend to this very same population. Young people, young professionals trying to get a break and get into the economy and get their first job and all this kind of stuff. This is a program essentially designed for what they used to call the ninis, ni estudian ni trabajan, right? But principally the young people, so that they're not seduced into the life of organized crime groups, which, as we know, is likely a dead end for the vast, vast majority of them. That program does not get a single mention in this article. How can you talk about the recruitment of young people without mentioning the flagship program aimed at trying to mitigate that from actually happening in Mexico? It, to me, strikes me as extraordinary and a definite failure of their so-called journalism. It's really, really disappointing, but there's a lot more we can say about this kind of article. And you had a really good point that you mentioned to me earlier, Kurt. Your thoughts on this?
It's simply a commercial for Trumpism, right? It's simply a commercial for Trumpism's plans to try to invade the country or do some kind of operations here in the country. Perfect for it. It's perfect for him, right? I mean, talk about an article that obeys an agenda. Just like Natalie Kitcherev's narco-AMLO attempts during the campaign that fell flat. Very clearly obeying an agenda. This one also does. The problem with this article from a journalistic point of view, Jose Luis, especially for an article that's above the fold on A1 on Sunday, is that it's a very speculative article, right? As you said, are there chemistry students out there maybe being, tempted by organized crime? Sure. But what this said was the cartels have a more ambitious goal. They want to synthesize these chemical compounds here in Mexico. It's a speculative article. It's about something that may happen, not something that is clearly already happening with numbers and evidence. It's a speculative article. They're saying this is something that they want to do. If they succeed, U.S. officials say, because the New York Times always just leans on U.S. officials and U.S. governmental sources as if they didn't lie all the time. It would represent a terrifying new phase in the fentanyl crisis. If they succeed, if this happens, this is speculative journalism, and this is not something that belongs on A1 unless you have a political agenda. It's so obvious. It's so clear. What belongs on A1 is actual reporting on actual things that have actually happened with actual evidence and actual numbers. But when you try to go to what the actual numbers are, Jose Luis, they don't have them. What they actually do say is it's unclear how widespread the recruitment of students has become. It's unclear. So, again, Jose Luis, what's the point of the article? Students are being tempted to do something which may happen, but we don't know how many of them there are. So what's the point of the article? What are you doing? You're obeying a political agenda. And that's what we've seen again and again from the Times, and that's what makes this so sad.
Yeah, and will likely have consequences, right? I mean, you can't do propaganda for Trump and not think that it's actually going to resonate. I mean, some of the postmortems I've seen is just, it's extraordinary when you realize how much influence pundits and media outlets have over decision makers in the halls of office, in the halls of power, right? Apparently, Matthew Iglesias was well read in the Biden White House. I think this kind of stuff does make it onto people's desks and makes it so that this could possibly inform policy. Now, there's this really kind of sensational picture here that I wanted to pull up, which is apparently the chemicals used to produce fentanyl on the floor of a drug cartel safe house in Culiacan, Sinaloa. So here you have this picture. Now, I have a friend over at Sin Embargo, took this picture and compared it to one from the government of Canada about a fentanyl lab that was found and decommissioned there. Quite extraordinary, and I want to read out his text here. This is a Mexican fentanyl laboratory on the front page of the New York Times. the Canadian fentanyl laboratory, which did not make it onto the cover of the New York Times. Which one looks more sophisticated to you? The Canadian one, obviously.
Yeah, just
But
a
they
little
don't
bit.
get the
Just a
A1 above the fold story, do they? No. No, they don't. Why? Because it doesn't fit the narrative. Because there are probably interests as well that are seeking to kick Mexico out of the free trade agreement in order to favor the interests of Canadian and US capital. So this is a very clear example of the consequences of that kind of policy. I would suspect, and now this is me just speculating, so take it with a grain of salt, is that media outlets are once again panicking at the notion of a Trump presidency. They know that they can probably get some more readers if they kind of join the resistance, but other ones, and perhaps this is the strategy of the New York Times, are also trying to win over those Trump supporters. To be like, no, you can read us too. We're not just a paper for liberals. That was definitely the strategy of the Washington Post. So is it possible that this is what's motivating the New York Times? Trying to see like, look, we can also join in on these attacks on our neighbor on the South. And I think you made a really good point too. I mean, the parallels to the odious behavior of some of the reporters at the Times during the election, where they were clearly trying to intervene, clearly trying to drive a narrative. All right. And finally, of course, there was this really good comment made by Gladys Sheinbaum today, December 2nd, during the morning press conference. Because if this sounds a little bit too
far-fetched?
Out of Hollywood, too far-fetched, as you say, Kurt, well, that's because it does sound like it came out of the series Breaking Bad, which is what Claudia said this morning, that perhaps they're being influenced by these kinds of stories, wishing them to be true.
This is the milieu that these people operate in within, this kind of this lurid ideas of Mexico, the biases, the prejudices, the Netflix series, I'm sure, when Kitchereff finally writes her biography of her time in Mexico, she's going to have a chapter on how she survived Mexico and all of this. And, it's just, Mexico is just Breaking Bad land for these people. Although obviously that takes place in the United States, but just kind of cartel land for these people, right? People have no agency. People, who attend Lopez Obrador's rallies are only there because they're getting bought off by social programs. This is just, it's a passive, bought-off, populist enthrall to messianic leaders who unfortunately aren't listening to these kind of stories from the New York Times, as they should be. They're betters. And so when she was asked about it in the press conference, Claudia gave this just very, with her very classic Sangfreud, she says, this sounds like a series. She said, I asked about it in, the security cabinet this morning. They said there was no evidence of it. Now, of course, we shouldn't take that on face value either. Everything should be investigated and researched. She said there was no evidence of it. So, it really seems like it sounds something more like a series, And of course, the series where that guy's like, the hero because, the U.S. has no healthcare, so he has to become a drug dealer, right? Well, sorry, that's not Mexico. That may be the Mexico in your head, right? That may be the Mexico in your head, but that's not the real Mexico that millions of people here live, right? Where addiction isn't as bad of a problem in the United States, right?
But you have social programs.
Where there are social programs, right? Where there is outreach, right? Where there's a lot more to go, right? But the idea of just playing on these stereotypes to throw Mexico under the bus, as Trudeau is doing for his, miserable little political reasons, or as the New York Times is doing for its own miserable little reasons, as they tried to do during the campaign, that's just not only does it demonstrate an ignorance of the United States' largest trading partner, right? But it just goes to show, with the whole mining thing that we talked about, just to kind of, close the circle on this episode, right? That the colonial era has not ended at all. And so, you will use Mexico, you will suck minerals out of Mexico, you will use it when it's convenient for your political purposes, and otherwise, you'll just crap on it. Be it from the press, be it from the politicians, be it from whomever, right? And that, that era is over. Right? That their influence isn't what it was. And that's why, Moreno won by 30 points this year, despite a concerted press campaign against it. And that, I think, was the most gratifying of that whole thing.
And that's why we're so grateful for everybody who's tuned in this week to you, our viewers and listeners. And of course, a special thank you for the St. Patrick's Battalion, always there supporting our work directly. If you can, become a member of the channel, help us keep this program going. If not, please give it a like, share, subscribe, all the rest of it. You know how it goes. Kurt, any last words?
That's it, Jose Luis. My name is Kurt Hackbarth, writing for Jacobin Magazine in the U.S. and Tito Común. This has been another edition of Soberania, eh? The Canada Edition.